In this lesson, we're going to take a look at your first full-size guitar chords. We're going to look at 3 types of chords, but we're going to learn the major and the minor variants, so 6 chords in total. If you are absolutely brand new to guitar, do check out the previous lesson where we go over how to get in tune, among other things, and do subscribe to the channel so you can follow along with all the lessons, and remember you can pick up some extra resources on Patreon via the link in the description. For now though, let's have a look at these chords. So the first chord we're going to start with today is going to be an E major chord, so the happy sounding version of an E. We're going to start with first finger on first fret of the G string, second finger is going to go on second fret of the A string, and third finger is going to sit in between on second fret of the D string. E major uses all 6 strings, so I'm going to try and make sure that nothing is muted, and if I strum all of them, get a nice big E chord sound. Remember to go through each string individually and make sure that none of them are muted by a finger lying down too flat. Really common in this one is that the third finger will lie down too flat and mute the G string, or that the first finger will lie down too flat and mute the B. Might take a little bit of work to get all them strings ringing out, but definitely worth it to get a good sounding E chord. So from our E chord, we're going to dive straight into E minor because it's super simple. All you have to do is take the first finger off. By adding that open G string, we're turning our E major into an E minor because that's the note that makes it sound sad. So here was the E major, and if I take the first finger off, you can hear it's got a much darker and more melancholic sound, and if I pick each string individually, you can hear that all 6 of them are ringing out nice and clearly. Again, in this one, it tends to be the third finger lying down too flat that ruins it, and it actually takes away that minor sound, which means you're losing the characteristic of the chord. So really important that you get all the notes ringing out together. The next chord that we're going to look at is going to be an A major chord, and this is the first chord that you come to which has a selection of ways that you can play it. So I'm going to show you 3 ways, and you should try all of them and see what works best for you. The first one is to use fingers 1, 2 and 3. So we're going to start with nothing on the low E string, we're going to avoid it for now. You're going to have the open A string. First finger is going to be on second fret of the D string. Second finger is going to be on second fret G. And third finger is going to squeeze on second fret B. You're then going to leave the high E string open and get that one on top. So you can see we've got 3 fingers all squeezed into 1 fret here, which is one of the things that makes this chord difficult, because you see my first finger is forced right into the back of the fret, which if you remember from the previous lesson is where you get these sort of these half notes that don't sound too good. So you might want to angle your hand this way a little bit and just squeeze the first finger up slightly. You might have to squeeze quite hard, like press the string hard with the first finger to get the note ringing out good. But once you've got the other 3 fingers on, you should get a full sounding chord. Remember, it's just the top 5 strings, so they should sound like this. Obviously, in this version of the chord, the first finger tends to be a bit of an issue, takes a little bit of work, and also third finger touching the top string as well. I think as a beginner you should have a little bit of leeway at first. If the top string isn't ringing out, it's not the worst thing in the world, but in the long run, do try and be able to get each note to ring out. The second option for this A major chord is to play exactly the same notes on exactly the same fret, but use the back 3 fingers rather than the front 3. So this time, second finger will be playing D string, third finger will be playing G, and little finger will be playing B, and if I pick the notes, they'll sound exactly the same as they did before. Obviously the guitar doesn't really mind which finger you press which note with, it's just the selection of notes that matters. So the big benefit for this one obviously is the fact that you've got little finger now, which means that unlike the previous one, the third finger isn't going to be forced quite as far back into the fret because little finger's a little bit smaller, so you can squeeze all your fingers a bit closer to that fret where it's easier to play. The disadvantage of this one is actually getting the little finger to cooperate, because obviously it's not as strong as your other fingers, so it might take a little bit of work with the little finger. The third and final option for this A chord starts with first finger in the middle on the G string, second finger going physically above it on the D string, and third finger physically below it on the B string. So you can see we're now making a little triangle shape with the fingers, and again, if I strum all the notes, sounds exactly the same because we're playing all the same strings and the same frets. The benefit of this one is that you can get both of these two fingers, fingers 2 and 3, right up against the fret, so that first finger can sit in the middle of the fret and actually none of them are forced back. So there is quite a big advantage to this version of an A chord, but to be honest, it's not the one that I would recommend, because when we get into chord embellishments later on, this is the most difficult one to apply those embellishments to. So there's a few things to consider when you're choosing which A chord you want to stick with. It might take a few weeks before you actually settle on one, but do definitely try all of them and see what works best for you. Next, we're going to look at the A minor chord, so the sad sounding version of an A chord, and we're going to start with first finger on the first fret of the B string. Second finger is going to go on the second fret of the D string, and third finger is going to go on the second fret of the G string, and it should sound like this. Hopefully a few of you have realised that that shape is very familiar, because it's actually exactly the same shape as the E chord, the E major, but on different strings. So there's my E major. And then if I move all the fingers up a string in pitch, I get the A minor. So these two chords are actually a really good pair of chords to start trying to change between, because you don't actually have to change the shape of the fingers, you just have to jump between the strings. It's also got quite a cool kind of classical sound to it, so that's a good one to get started changing chords with. Now this A minor, we can approach it from a few different ways to try and remember how to play it. If you like the second version of the A chord, with the back 3 fingers playing the second fret, all you have to do is take the little finger off and replace the note on the B string with first finger instead. Or you can, if you've memorized that E major shape, you can just think about playing it on the other strings. But because it's an A chord, you want to avoid the low E string and just strum the top 5 strings, which individually sound like this. And it's normally the top 2 strings that people tend to struggle with on this one, so do the individual picking and make sure you can get all the notes ringing out. Now I also want to use this A minor chord as a chance to explain about thumb muting. So thumb muting is where the thumb comes over the top of the guitar and touches one or more of the lowest strings. Now because we're playing this A minor chord, we want the lowest note to be the A string, not the low E string. So I'm actually using my thumb to come over the top and just gently touch that E string, so you can hear it's muted rather than ringing out full. That's it without the thumb. With the thumb on, I'm just touching it a little bit, and it stops that note ringing out. So when I strum, I don't have to think about hitting specific strings. I can just strum freely with my right hand, and all the notes are controlled with the left hand. Now the A minor chord is quite a friendly one to start experimenting with the thumb muting. There are definitely other chords where it's more difficult, but I would still only recommend trying it once you've got each note ringing out perfectly and you can play the chord consistently. You also want to make sure that when you apply the thumb mute, it doesn't change the hand position too much and you start sacrificing notes in the chord to get the thumb on top. So that's a little bit more of a long-term goal, but definitely something that you should think about when you're kind of building your muscle memory of these chords. Next up is D major chord, which only takes place on the top 4 strings. So we're going to start with the open D string, first finger on 2nd fret G, third finger is going to go on 3rd fret B, and second finger is going to squeeze on the top string on the 2nd fret. So you have to make sure that the first finger isn't too close to the fret, otherwise it's going to block the second finger out and it's going to struggle to fit in. But at the same time, you don't want it to be right at the back of the fret where you get a dodgy note. So you probably want the first finger to be about in the middle of the fret. That leaves a bit of space for second finger, and then third finger can sit on the next fret just in between them there. And again, only the top 4 strings, so make sure they all ring out. Top string is definitely the one that normally goes wrong in this chord. And with regards to the thumb muting, again, don't try and throw the thumb muting in straight away. That's more of a long-term thing. But when you're first getting started with it, you probably only want to bring the thumb over to mute the bottom string, because even though this chord's only meant to be the top 4 strings, the open A string doesn't really sound too bad. If I give you an example, you you would definitely get away playing that in a song. But in the long term, thumb is going to come over and actually mute the bottom 2 strings. Now that's a lot more difficult and takes a lot more training, but it does mean that when you strum a D chord, you can strum your right hand freely and only get them top 4 strings. So that is a D major. Onto the D minor now, and this is probably the hardest one to visualize in reference from the original major chord, because we're only going to change 1 note, but we have to change 2 finger positions to achieve it. So what we're going to do is, if you take that D major chord, second finger is going to replace first finger. So 2nd fret G string, first finger is going to come off and play that 1st fret of the top string. Now if I play that chord, here it's got a much more sad minor-y sound than the D major that we had before. The only thing that's actually changing is the note on the top string, but there's absolutely no way that that second finger is going to want to squeeze in and play that 1st fret, so that's why we have to do the little finger swap instead to achieve that D minor. Same rule with the thumb muting. Don't worry about it at first, just get the notes ringing out nice and clearly. The top string is the tricky one, just like the D. When you're comfortable with that, bring the thumb over and get the bottom string muted, and then eventually, long-term goal, get the bottom 2 muted so that when you strum, you just get them top 4 strings. So next steps, once you've got those chords down, would involve trying to move between them. As I mentioned before, the A minor and the E major are a great place to start because they're the same finger shape, just on different strings. I suppose the next thing you'd want to think about is getting the thumb to work as well. So when you're playing the A chord, thumb's coming over the top and muting the E, and then it's disappearing around the back. When you play the E chord and revealing that open E string, A minor, it's back on again, E, it's lifted off again. And then in the other chord changes, you just want to look for things that are similar in the finger positions in the chords. For example, if I'm moving between E major and A major, especially in the version that I like to play with the back 3 fingers, their middle 2 fingers, these 2, can stick together. And it feels like much more of an efficient change than taking the whole hand off and then finding the new chord again, like this sort of thing. Similarly, if you're moving between E major and D major, while I'm doing that change, I can keep the first finger on this string and just slide it along, and then throw in the other fingers for the rest of the D chord. Then for the E, I'm just sliding back, then sliding up again, and I essentially have like a pivot point under that first finger to kind of quickly get the chord on, and it feels a little bit less kind of erratic than taking the whole hand off and trying to find the shape for all the fingers to go in again. There will be some chord changes that you do where the finger positions have nothing in common. For example, like if you're moving between an E minor and a D minor, the only option is to take all the fingers off, kind of make the shape of the new chord, then throw them down again. So those kind of changes require a little bit more repetitive practice and a little bit more muscle memory. But have a bit of a play about with changing chords. The best way to learn to change chords is to play songs, which is why we're going to jump into some great songs to learn as soon as possible. And one final thing I want to talk about in this lesson is root notes. Now the root note is the note that the chord is based off. So for example, an E major chord is based off of an E note, or an A minor chord would be based off of an A note. That would be the root note. Now most of the time, and especially in the first few chords you learn on guitar, the root note is the one that's lowest in pitch. So if I play an E major chord, the note that I'm hearing that is actually the lowest in pitch is the low E string, the open string. So that would be the root note of our E chord. If I move to an A minor, remember the thumb's going to come over the top and mute that E string, so the lowest string that you're actually hearing is the open A string. So that A note is the root of the A minor chord. Similar in the D chords, if thumb can come over and mute both the bottom strings, the lowest note is the note D, the open D string, which is the root of your D major and your D minor chords. Now, when you find the root note at the bottom of a chord, which it is in most cases, we would say that that chord is in root position. When the root note isn't at the bottom of the chord, we would call that an inversion because it's like the notes in the chord have been inverted. For example, if you're playing the version of D chord where you're starting out with the thumb muting but you're just muting the bottom string, the root note is still the D string, even though it's not the one on the bottom, we're just adding the A string underneath. Okay, so here's our root note, the D string, but underneath that we've got the A. It just so happens we can get away with it because A is one of the notes involved in a D chord. I would definitely recommend that you start to learn where some of the root notes are on the guitar. These chords are pretty simple because the root notes are all just the open strings, but soon we're going to be playing chords which are rooted on fretted notes higher up the neck, so it's definitely worth starting to build that mental map of the fretboard. So yeah, that's just a quick introduction to things like root notes and inversions that you're going to encounter on your guitar journey further down the line. So now you have your E, A and D chords in both major and minor form. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can follow along with all the lessons, and remember you can pick up all the chord diagrams and some extra resources on my Patreon page. In the next lesson we're going to look at 3 more chords, so I'll see you in that one.